All right, good afternoon. We're gonna get the colloquium started. Before I introduce our presenter, I want to remind us, including the virtual folks for joining us on Zoom, the rules for our colloquium. Closed captioning is available if you press the CC button at the bottom of the Zoom screen. The question period, when we get there, if you're joining us in person, you can use your hand function. If you're joining us on Zoom, please use either the chat or the Q&A to raise your question. And what we will not today be able to promote you to panelist or unmute you, but you can, your question will be read aloud and addressed. And if you have any technical issues at all, we have folks kind of monitoring the chat, and please raise those questions so the presentation is as accessible as possible. Can you advance the slide? We recognize at these events, we recognize that, I don't see the, ooh, it's not shared yet. Please hold. Cool. Okay. Thank you so much. The department recognizes that the University of Michigan its origins on a land grant from the Anishinaabe, including Odawa, Ojibwe, and Potawatomi, and the Wendat. The university continues to exist on the historical territorial land of the Anishinaabe people. Odawa, Ojibwe, and Potawatomi are collectively called Anishinaabe Mewoan, and they belong to the Algonquin language family. There are currently 12 recognized Anishinaabe tribes in the state of Michigan, and many Anishinaabe people living throughout the state and interacting with the University of Michigan. I want to now introduce our presenter today. This is Dr. Ming Xiang, is joining us from the University of Chicago, where she's an associate professor in the Department of Linguistics. She's been faculty in Chicago since 2010. She completed her PhD in 2005 at Michigan State University, a community that's much on our minds this week. After finishing her PhD, she completed postdoctoral research at the University of Maryland. Dr. Xiang's research stands at the intersection of psycholinguistics, semantics, syntax, speech perception, and we will learn more today about language contact as well. And I'm probably understating the reach. Across all these domains, her research combines theoretical precision and careful, precise experimentation, using many tools, EEG, eye tracking, judgments, and more. Her recent work appears in a variety of venues: language, cognitive science, semantics and pragmatics, glossa, many more. She's a co-PI on, as far as I can tell, at least 2 NSF grants. And I was checking through, and the number of advisees with doctoral dissertation research grants from the end, it's impressive, is what I'm saying. So amazing service to our community, to our scholarship community, and to our kind of the next generation. And with that, I would like to introduce Dr. Xiang, who's going to be presenting a talk whose title I don't see. Reducing Uncertainty in Contact-Induced Syntactic Change. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Okay, so can people hear me okay? All right, thank you, and thanks, John, for that introduction. Okay, so as John was saying, I did my graduate studies at MSU, and so this week, while I was actually preparing for the slides, and I heard the shocking news from MSU, so I was already very excited to be invited to give this talk, and now I'm just even more grateful I have this opportunity to come here so I can go to see some old friends and give my personal support there. So the talk I'm going to give today is about language contact. And this is actually some new project I'm working on, and I'm sort of stepping a little bit out of my usual comfort zone here. So I know there's a lot of people in this audience who know a lot more about syntactic change or language change in general, about language contact. about probably just about everything I'm going to talk about. So I'm looking forward to the feedback from you. And so before I start, I want to, normally I make the acknowledgement at the end, but today I want to make the acknowledgement to all the collaborators and also to the University of Chicago, Francis and Rose Yuan campus in Hong Kong, because to be honest, I have to confess, in the very beginning, the reason I started this project is because the Hong Kong Center gave me a grant. So, so I started this project, and then it was totally a COVID project. The first set of pilot data we collected, then a few days later, COVID broke out, we couldn't go back. And then there was a lot of support I got from local RAs and collaborators, and actually the last couple subjects I collected, I will present today, was collected at the end of last year, and COVID broke out again in China, and then there was just a lot of support from the local folks. So I couldn't have finished this project. Actually, it's an ongoing project, it's not finished, but I couldn't do anything I'm going to tell you about without their help. So I just want to acknowledge their support first. Okay, so the larger question I want to talk about today is about language change and how that interacts with language learning and language processing. So the general intuition is that language change could arise when the younger generation of speakers just do not fully replicate the patterns they hear in the input, right? So from the learning perspective, the question is, under what circumstances do speakers replicate or they deviate from the linguistic patterns in the input? So this question is sort of difficult to tackle because from the diachronic change perspective, so that sort of change happens at a time scale, at a much larger time scale, and happens over many generations of speakers. It's just a little bit hard to track exactly what's going on during that process. And experimental work, on the other hand, on language acquisition or language processing normally happen in a more constrained laboratory settings, and normally we sort of take a look at a snapshot of what's going on in this very constrained setting. So when we started this project, we thought maybe it would be helpful if we can look at contact situations, since we know language contact can lead to language change. And there are a lot of communities in the world that are under intensive contact with other languages. So maybe this would be a good opportunity for us to try to make some connections between language change and language learning and language processing. So the particular empirical question we're looking at is this, or this particular empirical starting point is this pattern people have observed in statistical learning literature. So this is the regularization pattern people have observed. So while learning a probability distribution from the input data, it has been observed that both children and adults show the tendency to reduce unpredictable variability in the data. Children especially do so, but adults can be made to do so when the probabilistic variation in the data is complex. Okay, so here is just like a toy example adapted from Hudson Cam and Newport 2005 and 2009. So if you have in this little artificial language learning paradigm, if you create artificial language, give people determiners. So there are 3 different types of determiners that a person could use. And suppose one of them is the most frequent, 60% in the input. The other 2 are less frequent, 20% each. And after you expose participants to this little language for a little bit, and then observe their production in this little language, they start to produce more of the most frequent determiner beyond the 60% frequency in input. Okay. So this is the general description of what regularization does. Okay. So that the older experiments looking at this sort of more like a one generation or one-time learning, but the later work also have extended this regularization result or simulated this result in the iterated learning model and try to simulate a multi-generation outcome that also can create or generate this kind of regularization process. Okay, so the general idea is very simple. The speaker of one generation, they're going to take in some input and estimate in their mind what's the underlying parameters that generate that input, right? And using that parameters, they estimated they are going to generate their own production, and their production becomes the input of the next generation. And you can see this iterated process going on. And then at some point, you see some changes emerge, some more drastic change emerges at some point of this learning process. So more relevant to the current purpose is that this regularization process has also been conceptualized as a kind of uncertainty reduction process, especially if we quantify this outcome using the entropy measure, right? So this is a measure about uncertainty in the data. So if I use the earlier toy example I have, if you have 3 determiners in the input, each occurs in certain frequency, the initial, sorry, maybe you can't see that at the very bottom, the initial entropy is 1.37. But if you regularized over this input and started to produce the first determiner 19% of the time, the other determiners 5% of the time, then you can see the entropy is smaller at 0.57. Okay, so essentially your production patterns become more predictable, and there's less uncertainty associated with that. All right, so that's the basic idea about the statistical learning results. There are a couple challenges, and I think very important challenges to the basic idea. So the first challenge is the previous studies on this regularization pattern the conclusions mostly came from artificial language learning paradigms. And these paradigms usually drastically reduce the linguistic complexity in the learning environment. And another thing it reduces, or most of the time completely ignores, is the social linguistics variables that play important roles in learning in reality. Okay. So the question then is, can the conclusions from these studies apply to the acquisition change of real or natural languages in the world? And another challenge, or maybe another puzzle related to this body of work, is that this body of work normally focuses on 2 processes. One is regularization. The other one is probability matching to the input. Okay, but we know in the real world, in language communities, people don't just remove variants from their language or probability match the input. They also constantly innovate and introduce new variants into their language. And this sort of model is totally silent on that kind of processes. Okay. So in the current study, I'm going to try to do 3 things, or in this talk, I'm going to try to do 3 things. First, I'm going to report some of the results we find that document a natural language regularization process in progress. But specifically, this process did not happen automatically. It seems to be triggered specifically by language contact. And the other, so next, we're going to show some lab experiments that probe the cognitive mechanisms that may be responsible for the change observed in communities. And finally, I will also show some sort of quite preliminary data that demonstrates the coexistence of both reducing variants and also introducing new variants into so the same population is doing that. Okay? And I'm going to make a tentative proposal to try to reconcile these 2 different observations. So the particular populations we're going to look at is the Cantonese-speaking population in Guangzhou and in Hong Kong. So in China, I don't know if you can see my pointer. So you can see at the bottom of this map of China, there are a number of different languages spoken in southern China marked in green. But at the very bottom, where this number 6 is where Guangdong is. And Guangzhou is a city in Guangdong province. And Hong Kong is just right next to it. So it's about an hour on the high-speed train from Guangzhou to Hong Kong. It's very close to each other. Okay? And the dominant local language spoken in Guangzhou and Hong Kong is Cantonese. Okay? Sorry, another thing interesting is this is a map of Chinese linguistics groups from 1990. And the interesting thing you'll note is next to Hong Kong it says UK, next to Macau it says Portuguese. So that's actually going to be relevant. So Cantonese in the dominant, so as I said, Cantonese is the dominant local language spoken in Guangzhou and in Hong Kong. Cantonese and Mandarin are mutually unintelligible because they have different phonology, but they share similarities in syntax. Okay? And speakers in both cities are in close contact with Mandarin, but the two populations also have very different linguistic experiences and language attitudes. So just very quickly, well, in Guangzhou, like any other cities in mainland China, they use standard Mandarin as the official language, and Mandarin is the medium of instruction in school education. In Hong Kong, Cantonese is the official language, and Hong Kong was a British colony for a long time before 1997. Mandarin increased its impact after 1997, but English was a major language for a long time, and it's still an important language nowadays. Okay? So these are the Cantonese participants we tested in these two cities. We tried to sample from each generation of speakers. And these are all self-reported, highly proficient native Cantonese speakers. And we tried to only test participants who were born to Cantonese-speaking families who were sort of living in the area and have never left for a long period of time. Okay? And we did give them a long questionnaire to get a sense about their sociolinguistics background. And I'm just going to give you a few questions for you to get a sense about the differences between these two groups, even though they're really are very close in distance. So as you can see, some of the questions target at their proficiency in Mandarin. If we ask how is your spoken Mandarin, how's your listening comprehension ability in Mandarin, and this plot will show on x-axis is the age, and the y-axis is their proficiency level. You can see people's proficiency in Mandarin is increasing from older to younger generation in both cities. Okay? And if you ask about the Cantonese proficiency, you can see they both are pretty stable. All of them think they're highly proficient Cantonese speakers at the highest level you can anticipate. And also, if you ask them how often do they speak Mandarin, speakers in Guangzhou, in red, speak much more Mandarin than the speaker in Hong Kong, but overall there's still an increase compared to the older generations. Okay? As to how often they would speak Cantonese, you see overall they have a pretty good frequency in both cities in speaking Cantonese, but Hong Kong speakers speak more Cantonese than speakers in Guangzhou. And about language attitudes, this is language attitudes towards Mandarin. And as you can see, Guangzhou speakers are pretty stable from 70 years ago to now. Hong Kong speakers have a decreased positive attitudes towards Mandarin. And about Cantonese towards Cantonese, attitudes towards Cantonese, both cities are very positive attitudes towards Cantonese. And it's actually interesting, 70 years ago, speakers in Hong Kong have slightly less positive attitudes towards Cantonese. This is just to show that, at least in Hong Kong, English is another language that's worth a lot of attention. You can see if you look at their attitudes towards English, their proficiency in English, and their usage frequency in English, all of these are going up from older generations to younger generations. All right. So tentatively, we can conclude that both speakers in both cities have very positive attitudes towards Cantonese, and their Mandarin are both, their proficiency level in Mandarin are both increasing. But for Hong Kong speakers, their attitudes towards Mandarin is going down a little bit, and they also have very positive attitudes towards English. So English was probably a language that's more positive in their mind than Mandarin is. Okay? All right, so given that sort of a little bit complicated social linguistics background, I want to introduce the first experiment that's just looking at the word order changes in ditransitive structures in Cantonese. So here the stimuli are actually very simple. Give people this picture. There's no like usual 2x2 design. There's no particular manipulation. We just give them a set of pictures with verbs that can be used ditransitively. We have some critical items, and we have some fillers. And we just ask them, we'll give them the verb, and we give them the arguments, names, and we ask them to make a sentence. Okay? And as I said earlier, we tested 2 groups of Cantonese speakers. We also tested a separate control group who speaks Beijing Mandarin variety. We tested them in Beijing. Okay? For that particular variety, we did not have as many participants. We did not have the 60 to 70-year-old range. So looking at sort of the overall average, what happens, the first thing to take note is that Cantonese and Mandarin, although they share a lot of similarities in syntax, and the overall range of structures people produce are very similar on this task, the probability distribution is really different. As you can see, I picked the top 4 or 5 options people have produced. They are very different. So in Mandarin, the most frequent pattern is this PIO-VDO pattern. And in both Cantonese groups, it's the VDO-PIO pattern. Okay? The Guangzhou speaker and the Hong Kong speaker actually has very similar distributions. And if you look at the Cantonese speakers in Guangzhou, you notice that, so I plot on the right, you can see with age, because there is a, maybe look at it this way, there's a positive correlation when people getting younger and younger. The younger generations start to use more and more of the most frequent structure, the VDO-PIO structure. They start to use that more, okay? If you break down age into age windows, you can see the increase of the most frequent structure steadily increase, okay? And you can see that, so this blue PIO-VDO is the Mandarin, the most frequent pattern in Mandarin. And you can see that there's no assimilation to the Mandarin pattern at all, even though they are in contact with Mandarin. Okay? What they are doing really is just an internal regularization of their most frequent pattern already. And I did calculate the syntactic frame entropy. So this is calculated at each generation of speakers in 10 years age window. And you can see the entropy is going down steadily across generations. So there is this entropy reduction or uncertainty reduction across generations. So that's in Guangzhou. And in Hong Kong, the picture is very similar. You see younger people start to use the most frequent structure more and more often. And you see that syntactic frame entropy is going down from the older to younger speakers. And you can see there's no assimilation to the Mandarin pattern at all. Okay? So we do observe this regularization process in Cantonese. But is this regularization process, is this happening due to language contact in a bilingual, multilingual environment? Or is that just going to happen anyway during a 70-year window, right? Something's just going to happen there. So we looked at our speakers from Beijing. So they are speaking the Beijing variety of Mandarin. And you can see that nothing has changed. They seem to be perfectly probability matching what their older generation is doing. Okay, so the percentage of their most frequent option, the word order, stays the same. And there's also no particular systematic entropy change. Seems to have gone up slightly, gone down slightly, then also gone up a little bit. So there's no particular pattern there. So just to summarize the first part, we see 2 groups of Cantonese speakers. Despite their different language experiences and language attitudes, they show very similar regularization patterns in this particular construction we tested. Mandarin speakers in Beijing showed probability matching to their input data. So we concluded that the change we saw in Cantonese is triggered by language contact, but we also saw that the direction of the change is not assimilation to Mandarin, it's just internal reorganization of the choices they have. Okay, so now I want to probe the mechanism a little bit. So first, I'm going to suggest that this particular change does not seem to be motivated by social linguistic reasons, since the 2 groups of Cantonese speakers, as we saw, have somewhat different language experience and attitudes, but they produced very similar changes. Okay? And we're going to try to probe the idea that this process is likely triggered by the cognitive pressure speakers sort of face when they need to manage in a bilingual, multilingual environment. this idea is consistent with some findings in the statistical learning literature that finds that if you increase the cognitive load in these lab experiments, that's likely to introduce more regularization in the lab. Okay. So in particular, we're going to compare two hypotheses. These are sort of broad classes of hypotheses. So hypothesis one is that being in a bilingual or multilingual environment makes it difficult to accurately track and encode the properties of the input. Okay, so if you can't accurately track what's going on in the input, you wouldn't be able to actually probability match the input. Okay? And the second hypothesis is that it's actually not about your ability to track things. It's about when you actually are in the mode, in the bilingual environment, you're constantly kind of trying to switch between different languages. And maybe that bilingual production process poses some memory retrieval difficulty while you're trying to do production planning. And the easiest way to help yourself is to just grab the most frequent pattern and generate that pattern during the moment where you're trying to do production planning. So maybe that's why we see regularization. This set of experiment is trying to test hypothesis one, this tracking or encoding input idea. So this is a lab experiment doing this short-term learning paradigm where people were tested twice. There's a pre-test, they just did the task I showed you earlier. There's a post-test, they did exactly the same task. But what's important is in between, they were exposed to some trials, and this exposure will hopefully give us some sense about what they can learn and cannot learn from the exposure. Okay, so I'm going to focus on what's going on in what we manipulated in the exposure. So the pre-test and post-test are exactly the same picture description task I gave you earlier. Okay, so the exposure phase, there are two groups of participants, depending on which exposure group they looked at. So the bilingual exposure group is a group of participants during the exposure. They heard both Cantonese trials and Mandarin trials mixed together. There are 56 trials plus 18 fillers in each language. Okay? And for the Cantonese trials, they heard 3 types of word orders for a ditransitive event. And we picked the top 3 frequency from the earlier list of the ranking I showed you earlier. And for these top 3 word order options, they were arranged in the ratio that's consistent with the naturalistic or real world ratios of these 3 word orders. It's 12:1:1 of those 3 options. Mandarin trials have exactly the same number of trials, also picked the top 3. And the ratio is 9:3:2. That's also the real world ratio of these 3 options. Okay? So for the Cantonese only exposure group, these participants only heard Cantonese trials, and they heard sort of twice as much as the Cantonese trials as the other group. Okay. All right. So for both the bilingual and Cantonese only exposure groups, in the input, there's a salient Cantonese variant. That's the most frequent variant in the real world, this VDO-PIO variant. Okay? And our question is, will participants track the salient Cantonese variant in different ways depending on which exposure group they were in, and thus be primed by this salient variants in different ways in their post-exposure production phase? So here's the result. The conclusion is actually no. So if you look at this plot, on the left is the participants who saw the bilingual exposure phase. On the right are the participants who went through the Cantonese only exposure phase. Okay, so red is their production of the frequency of their producing that most frequent Cantonese variant. Red is the post-test. Blue is the pre-test. Okay, so I can see for both groups, they produced more, or they regularized, or they overproduced the already frequent variant if they were exposed to something that made that variant very salient. And this priming effect is exactly the same for both exposure groups. Okay? All right, so that seems to suggest that people's sensitivity to tracked input is not that different if you give them a bilingual environment to track or a monolingual environment to track. So now we're looking at the other hypothesis. Do people's production give you different results depending on whether they are in a bilingual production environment or a monolingual production environment? So this is, again, is a pre-test exposure, post-test setup. Pre-test is exactly the same as earlier. They have 41 Cantonese trials. They have to make a production. And exposure is mimicking the bilingual exposure phase as the last experiment, since bilingual exposure is what's going on in the real world. So we stayed with this exposure phase. The post-test production has two groups. So either participants are in a bilingual production group, or they're in a monolingual Cantonese-only production group. Okay, so let me explain the details of these two groups a little bit. So for the bilingual production group, they essentially were put in like an oddball paradigm. They saw a lot of pictures, and each picture there's a cue to tell them this is a Mandarin trial, or this is a Cantonese trial. They are forced to use one of those languages to make a sentence, but there are way more Mandarin trials than Cantonese trials. So the C is the Cantonese trial, and the Cantonese trial showed up like oddball in the sequence of trials. Okay. As you can see, the Cantonese trials in total is 41, Mandarin trials is 180, and the Cantonese trials contain those critical ditransitive verbs we want them to produce. Okay. In the Cantonese only production group, they did sorry, there's something showed up there. They did exactly the same thing, except that now all the Mandarin trials now are also in Cantonese trials. Okay, so the total number is also 40 plus 180, just everything is in Cantonese. So here, if we look at the result, now what I'm showing you is the result from the Cantonese-only production group, the monolingual production group. As you can see that there's actually no significant increase of the production of the most frequent variant in this group. Okay, so we think this is likely because in this experiment, there are over 200 trials in the production. Okay, unlike the last experiment, there was only 41 trials in the production phase. So there are way more production trials they have to do, and any sort of priming effect from exposure may have just decayed by this time because they have a much longer time went by between phases. Okay, but what's most important for us, if we look at the bilingual production group, they still produced more of the already frequent form in their production, even though when their monolingual counterpart speakers are not doing that. So it seems to suggest to us it's the pressure of switching between two languages, especially null setup, really sort of force them into this switching mode by setting up this oddball paradigm. So maybe it's the switching between languages during production that have made it more difficult to retrieve the correct target from memory. That interrupts the production planning of the target structure. And this production cost may have made participants more likely to produce the most frequent structure. Okay, so what I've shown is that there is a contact-triggered rapid regularization and entropy reduction process in the word order of Cantonese ditransitive construction. And I've shown you some lab experiments, give you some evidence at least that this observed pattern may be driven by the difficulty of the bilingual production process instead of the bilingual perception process. Okay, so now I want to show you the last bit of data that sort of demonstrate this coexistence of both reducing variation and increasing variation in the same population. I'm going to make a tentative proposal, see if we can reconcile the two. So the new data come from a different kind of word order variation. So in Chinese, the default word order is SVO, okay? But you can have this different structure, so the ba structures or ba is a morpheme. In Mandarin, so the ba structure changes the default SVO order to the SOV order, okay? So I give you a sentence here, if you can say Chef Wang, cook ready the lunch, that's the default word order. But if you use this bar structure, you actually can propose the object to be in front of the verb. So Chef Wang, bar lunch, cook ready. Okay? So you can see that, so this bar plus object verb order is widely used to convey particular type of events. So the events normally are telic, perfective, or they have resultative meanings that normally is considered as bounded event in some way. Okay? And the proposed object in this construction has a specific or definite interpretation, and is thought to be, in the traditional descriptive literature, is thought to be affected, dealt with, disposed of. I know it's not totally precise what it is, but I think it's still a topic pretty much in debate as to exactly what the semantics of these things are. And also just in general, object proposing in Mandarin has also been argued to indicate focus in general. So what's important here is there is actually a counterpart structure in Cantonese, so the jiang structure. So as you can see, I give you an example here. You can see a man wipe dry the water on the table, and you have the jiang there, then you have water, then you have the predicate wipe dry. Okay. But important to know is that the structure is actually very unproductive, as I will also show you some data. So it's much more productive in Mandarin than in Cantonese. Right. Okay, so what happened is that in our experiment 1, where we looked at participants cross multiple generations in the filler trials, we did include a few resultative events for people to describe. So there are 5 filler trials in the that ask people to describe a resultative event. And the resultative events are typical contexts that would trigger bar structures in Mandarin. So here's an example. You have the wipe clean predicate. So you either can say the man wiped clean the table, or the man bar the table wiped clean. Okay? And here you can see, if we look at Mandarin speakers in Beijing, again, there's a pretty stable learning or acquisition pattern. There's essentially no change across multiple generations. And another thing to point out is here you can see on average, people actually produced more bar structure, 60%, versus the regular verb object structure, 40%. So this is a very productive structure in Mandarin. And you can see that in Cantonese speakers in Guangzhou, overall, they did not produce that much of the corresponding jiang structure. As I was saying, the structure is very unproductive in Cantonese, but you can see clear increase as well. So, so from the very initial generation, there are 4%, and the youngest population, there's an average of 16% increase, and the entropy is going up. Okay, so they are, from this perspective, seems like they are increasing uncertainty from the entropy measure. Also, interestingly, if you look at the Cantonese speakers in Hong Kong, there's no change at all. So there's a flat line at the bottom, cross generations. And on average, this jiang structure was produced at around 6 to 7%. So I know this is not a lot of data, just 5 filler trials, but I think it gives us some initial questions. So it looks like for resultative predicates, there is a small but significant increase of the jiang structure in Cantonese spoken in Guangzhou, but there's no change in Hong Kong. Okay? So the first question is, why did the Cantonese speakers in Guangzhou introduce more variants into this word order variation of resultatives? And when they did not do so, they did not introduce more variants into ditransitive. They did not introduce a variant particularly related to Mandarin into ditransitives. So one hypothesis we're going to entertain is that there is a crucial difference between these 2 word order variations. The word order variation between verb object and the proposed bar structure, object proposed bar structure or jiang structure, is conditioned by semantics and pragmatics. As I said earlier, there's a clear semantic pragmatic motivation when you want to use the object proposed construction. Okay? And this morpheme bao jiang is also a salient morpheme in the language. On the other hand, for the ditransitive structures, the word variations is not signaled by any salient morpheme, and there's no particularly strong semantic pragmatics conditioning either. So we're trying to think through this insight from the literature that says the structure of using a marked form to express a specific meaning and an unmarked form for the more general or the elsewhere conditions. This is somewhat a familiar principle in pragmatics, and this strategy has also been argued to play a role in language change as well. Okay? So more specifically, I think a lot of the modern day modeling literature would assume that in the communicative context, a speaker's choice of using a particular form is determined by two things. It's essentially a trade-off between two variables. One is that how well the intended message can be recovered by the listener. The second is the cost of producing a particular form. There are different versions of this idea, but I'm just going to take an example from the rational speech actor model that says the speaker's probability of producing a particular utterance, giving a message the speaker wants to express, is sort of determined by two things. The first thing is the probability of a listener actually recovers that intended message, given that they heard that utterance, right? And also offset by some cost of that utterance for the speaker themselves. Okay? So I want to focus on the listener aspect of the calculation now. So imagine a toy example where a speaker has two variants. He has one message one he wants to deliver. He has two variants he can use to deliver that message one. And you can see variant one can deliver that message one, but variant one can also be used to deliver message two. Okay? And variant two can only deliver message one. So from the listener perspective, it's very clear that if the listener heard variant one, the probability he is to get at message one is only 0.5, assuming that both messages have the same prior probability. Okay? But if the listener heard variant two, it's unambiguous to him that it's message one that the speaker is trying to convey. Right? So from that perspective, it's clear that if the speaker decides, I'm going to use, if I want to deliver message one, I'd better use variant two, because that's unambiguous for the listener. It can reduce uncertainty for the listener through this disambiguation, right? So I think that's a reasonable hypothesis, given what the literature have said in general about pragmatic principles and about language change. But sort of an added twist here is that Cantonese speakers in Hong Kong was not affected by the spa structure in Mandarin, and they did not increase the corresponding Jiang structure in their production. Okay? So maybe there's some social linguistics reasons here. I'm throwing these reasons out there, but we don't have particular evidence for them yet. So that is the Hong Kong speakers, they less frequently use Mandarin, and second, they also have less positive attitudes towards Mandarin. Maybe it's prevented them from sort of being affected by a structure that could have helped them to disambiguate for the listener, but they chose not to do so. Okay? So I'm going to conclude, and there are a lot of future questions. So speakers can overproduce a frequent variant when under the pressure of bilingual, multilingual production, and this helps them to reduce uncertainty from the production perspective. At the same time, also influenced by language context, they can introduce more variation into their language from this other contact language, provided that increasing variation can reduce uncertainty for a listener to recover the intended message. Okay? And these general cognitive and communicative principles seem to also interact with social linguistic principles in some complex ways we don't quite understand. So that leaves us a lot of future questions. These are just a few. So first of all, we looked at relatively simple word order variations in Cantonese. what about other more complex empirical domains? And we're sort of doing some ongoing work that's looking at sentence final particles in Mandarin and Cantonese, and these particles encode, actually nobody knows what exactly they encode. It's somewhat about discourse functions, speech acts, and they have actually very elusive interpretations for a lot of even native speakers. We can use them, but we don't quite know what exactly they are doing. But there's a line of ongoing work looking at these particles in Mandarin and Cantonese, and also look at how things have changed in the last 70 years. So the next question is, what is the exact mechanism that social linguistic variables can interact with these other sort of cognitive and communicative principles that are at work simultaneously? There's also a question about different types of language contact environments. So we looked at a particular environment where the speakers we tested are highly proficient. The language is relatively healthy. So what about other communities, for example, heritage speakers who are not highly proficient speakers, or communities that have seen more shifts towards the dominant contact language, which is not exactly the case here. Okay. So these are all open questions. And with that, I'm just going to thank you.
All right, thank you. We have plenty of time for questions. And again, if you are joining us remotely, you can ask a question on the Q&A or the chat, and we will read it aloud. All right.
Yeah, my computer just did a thing, so hopefully this will go fast. Okay, so, actually, my computer closed down and now it isn't showing me the thing. Does maybe,
I think I could see the question here. Sorry.
No, thank you. So the question comes from Sally. Hi, Sally. Hi, Sally. Sally writing, okay, you keep writing more. Okay, hold on, I need to scroll. I can't. I'm just gonna start. Okay, hi, Sally. So Sally writes, the fact that Guangzhou and Hong Kong are undergoing similar changes does not mean that social factors are irrelevant in the changes, despite differences in the two context situations. There are also similarities, perhaps most notably, given your attitude indicators in attitude towards Mandarin versus Cantonese. She continues. And demonstrating that cognitive factors are affecting the process of change doesn't rule out the influence of social factors. Multiple causation is very common in all kinds of language change. I realize neither of my two comments look like a question. But what do you think about these issues?
Yeah, thank you. So, Sarah, thank you. I totally agree. I think the ruling out of the social linguistic factors in the explaining the regularization process may be too rushed. I think just at the moment, the regularization pattern is a pattern that's going against the Mandarin pattern. So it's not assimilation to the contact language. So for that reason, I haven't had any good ideas about if it's about social linguistics, what can lead to a pattern that's not an assimilation to the contact language, and it's also showing exactly the same pattern in these two populations. I think that was just sort of a challenge when we're trying to think what sort of social linguistic reasons could be there for that particular pattern. Yeah, but yeah, if there are any particular suggestions, we'll be really grateful to hear that.
Sally did follow up, so let me just add that as a continue. But people can still be thinking their questions. So Sally also writes, did you see any evidence of deliberate changes to make Cantonese more different from Mandarin? I'm guessing not, since no negative attitudes towards Mandarin. But deliberate distancing changes are also pretty common in contact situations where two closely related languages are in contact.
No, I think that's probably a limitation of our methodology. So these were mostly remotely collected because of COVID. So we did this picture description task on the one hand to just get a more quantitative picture of what's going on. On the other hand, it's really just one way we can get away from all the not able to do actual field work sort of situations. So I think it would be great if we can actually do more work in the communities, get some more spontaneous response, see if we can elicit different kind of responses and different kind of phenomenon beyond these word order changes. Yeah.
All right, other questions?
Thank you so much for this very interesting talk. So I have one question for, I think it's experiment 1. So you have bilingual contacts for them to listen to, and then also Cantonese only. I wonder why there's no Mandarin only, because if I misunderstand it, it's like, I don't have that background. It's like, maybe for the Guangzhou people, they will have a lot of input for Mandarin, but not for the Cantonese people. As you mentioned, like in the school, they use Mandarin. So I wonder, like, if you only have the only Mandarin, like, listening exposure, would that change their post-test production?
You mean if they only listen to Mandarin, it would affect their post-test production for Cantonese? Let me try to think why we didn't have that. Yeah, I think the reason we didn't have this at the time maybe was because the particular question we're trying to ask is because they are doing we're interested in the change in Cantonese, we're interested in that production. And the question we framed at the time is to ask whether their ability to track patterns particular to Cantonese would be different depending on whether they are exposed to only Cantonese or they're exposed to Cantonese plus something else. And that something else would disrupt their ability to track Cantonese, right? Because our question at the time was just whether they can reduplicate or they regularize the patterns in Cantonese specifically. So we were not asking a question about whether they can track Mandarin pattern and somehow the Mandarin pattern turn around and affects their Cantonese pattern. That was just not the question at the time we were asking, yeah. But I think that's an interesting thing to look at, yeah.
I had a follow-up question. I think it might be experiment 3, and I should check my notes so I get it right. So do I follow right, Ming, that
Sorry, this is still 2, yeah.
the data suggests that the regularization might be influenced by pressures during production?
Yeah.
Something like lexical access selection
Yeah.
pressures. So bilingual production is complicated, right? Because in the lab, it often is studied in terms of difficulty of like competing possibilities. But in the real world, we see a lot of cases of rapid language switching, code switching, very efficient kinds of communication. So I guess I'm wondering to what extent you would predict that this sort of regularization would be modulated by different kinds of difficulty settings. So for example, like you had an oddball paradigm.
Yep.
If that was less oddball-y, and therefore Cantonese was not under as much competition from Mandarin in production, would you expect a regularization to go down?
I think we would. So the initial idea here really was a very kind of a rough idea, thinking that the reason we see regularization is something about bilingual production increased cognitive load in the real world communities. And we wasn't quite sure like what in the cognitive load that was making this happening. So in the lab, we were just thinking, okay, we're going to try to make the task as difficult as possible for people. Try to just see if in sort of extreme situations, that hypothesis would hold to some degree. So that's why we did this oddball paradigm and just try to make the Cantonese production totally unpredictable. Like they all of a sudden were told, okay, you have to do Cantonese. Then they went on a few trials of Mandarin. So I think you are totally right. This is not exactly parallel to the real world situation. But at the same time, I think in real world situation, there are difficulties coming from other sources, right? Here is a very simple, what were the choices? They were giving like a simple picture to describe things. In the real world, in sort of conversation, there are a lot of things they have to plan and retrieve and make decisions about. So I don't know if in the real world situation, switching between languages is necessarily easier than this sort of artificial level of difficulty we created for them, yeah. And I actually don't know about whether code switching is an outcome of sort of in difficult situations, they do that, or by doing code switching, that would help them sort of relieve some pressure and not do more regularization. I actually don't know which direction it's going, yeah.
All right, thanks. Let me read out a question on Zoom. This is coming from Savi. Hi, Savi. Savi writes, hi, Ming. I have to step away in a sec to wrangle a baby, but I wanted to thank you for your talk, and in particular, I appreciate the entropy measure to look at a degree of variability. Looking across instances of contact-induced change, we do see both reduction and increases in word order flexibility, as you showed here. You were able to provide a unified model via uncertainty reduction, but as you move to different contact contexts, can you talk a little more about what other factors you think you'll need to put into your models to investigate differences across contexts?
I really think it's the social linguistics bit that is missing here. And we did, so going into this, we sort of not being a social linguist, I'm very poorly informed in that regard. So we did give people a long questionnaire to try to get all kinds of language experience, language attitudes, their attitudes toward the city, towards the cultural kind of different questions. But I think we're a little bit stuck, and we would like to get some suggestions here as well. Like, what is the best way to actually understand the social linguistic influence in these communities, right? I don't think giving them a long questionnaire exactly does the job. We have these, some of the questionnaire data there for you. We can do more fancy analysis on the questionnaire data. We can do more fancy correlations, but I don't think that actually gets to the bottom of the questions. How, like, what are the more nuanced ways to look at social linguistic variables and also combine that with kind of ability to do quantitative predictions or quantitative data analysis on things. I think that's something we're really stuck. But I do think that's an important piece in this whole puzzle, yeah. But on the one hand, I think this pragmatic principles is, in a way, also part of the social aspect of the whole picture. So there's the cognitive aspect of the picture. That's what we sort of trying to do with lab experiments, talking about production mechanisms and so on. The communicative principles, how the speaker coordinates with the listener, I think is, it's traditionally done under pragmatics, but I think it's there's a big connection there between that and the social linguistics as well. So, sorry, Tessa.
Yeah, no, I had kind of a follow-up thought to that. I was wondering if, and I might have, you might have mentioned this as well during your explanation of the different features that you were looking at, but I wonder if something that you could look at is like the salience, like the sociolinguistic salience of the different features that you're looking at. You kind of touched on how the ba morpheme is, you kind of hinted that it was a more salient morpheme, and I wonder, you could look into something like enregisterment. I know we have some linguists here that look at socially enregistered features and how those kind of tie to like whether those features become more widely used, especially in kind of contact situations. So I wonder if that's something that you've thought about.
I mean, like salient morphemes used in different registers?
So the idea, and I don't really know a lot about enregistrement, so somebody else could speak more on this, but I think the basic idea is that certain features also gain social salience
Yep.
for language users, and we enregister those social meanings along with the features, and then that might also play into whether that feature is selected as we're going in that production planning process that you talked about.
Right. Right. That's something we don't know. I think the social meaning aspect, especially with things that has like a salient marker, like these bar morphemes, I probably could have done like whether there's any correlation between language attitude and the change in the bar structure, just to see if there is any relationship between how people think about Mandarin and whether they would borrow this use into their own language. I could do something like that. We don't have a lot of data here, so I suspect there wouldn't be like a strong correlation there. But I thought about the general social meaning question. I think there are cases, I imagine, again, speaking totally as a like naive non-social linguist here. So I imagine in the real world, some markers has acquired strong social meaning, and some markers may not, but you nonetheless still see there's a big change in the way I describe here, like the bar construction. They still change in the way that overall you may feel the population generally speaking, seem to have a more positive attitudes towards Mandarin. That may explain they borrowed something from this language, but that positive attitudes may not directly translate into some conscious identity signaling morpheme, right? I feel like there are situations like that. And in those situations, then what would be a good way to capture that level, maybe that we call it unconscious, subconscious social meaning of things? I think it's a little bit more difficult. My understanding is a lot of the social meaning markers, we can interview people, get a sense about their explicit response to things, and maybe classify participants in that way. But if the social linguistic influence is more subtle at the individual level, I feel like there may need to be a kind of a better approach to capture that, but I don't know. Yeah.
Yeah, I apologize if I missed this, but did you look at gender at all as an independent variable? I'm not a sociolinguist either, but I know it's often the case that people who identify as women are at the vanguard of language change.
No, I actually haven't looked at that. I will, I will look at that particular feature. Yes, we do have that information. Yeah.
I thought you would.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ming, for this wonderful talk. I have a question that goes back to our previous discussion about the role of memory and prediction in language processing. And we were mainly focusing on language comprehension. So I'm wondering, because I'm not familiar with this like language production side, so I'm wondering if there are like similar accounts in also like accounting for language production, and if your experiments speak to like either of the accounts more. So I'm just curious about your thoughts about this.
Yeah, I think that it's probably just something the field should work more about production. The bit I'm kind of alluding to, the effect of memory in production, is largely just about in production planning. So if you sort of recall these old production models, like Dell model, and you have certain stages of processes, right? So you sort of have a concept you want to express, and then based on that concept, you need to retrieve some lemma representations, and then you need to retrieve some particular sort of the arrangement of your syntactic structures, right? So like in this case, like how you want to slot your lemma into a string of things, right? And there are different orders you can choose from. Those are all in your general kind of memory representations of your language, and you need to retrieve those sort of knowledge in your production planning before you start uttered sentences, right? So there are a lot of things going on that could be memory related, and I think the difficulty we created in production is just to disrupt those levels of planning. So we were thinking the disruption at the production planning is what gives us these results. So people have just too much difficulty, and then they go to grab the one that's easiest to grab. That's the most frequent one. Yeah. I think that's sort of the general sketch we are thinking right now about that. John wants to add something?
I just wonder how you want to connect this to theories that hold a very strong production perception link. Like in sentence processing, I think of Shotomoma, but we see also similar links at other levels, or simple theories of links at other levels of processing, and whether appealing to, like the model you described is a model that is really just a production model. And I wonder to what extent the aim for parallelism, to what extent that offers a different pathway towards the parallelism that you're talking about.
I don't think, I mean, that model was constructed as a production model, but I don't think there's anything inconsistent with comprehension models if we think the link is something like an indirect link, right? There is some representations that both production and comprehension need to recruit. That's the link, rather than saying there's like a direct link between, like, every time you are comprehending something, maybe you're simultaneously producing something. That's a more extreme level of linking, which I'm not sure I'm buying into, but I think at least there's this modest level of link, just as there are some representations there, either you're doing production or comprehension, you always need to go to that level of the representation. I think, assuming that, I don't think that model, that old production model, is inconsistent with that linking hypothesis.
Hi. Thanks a lot for this talk. It touches a lot of things I've been thinking about, and I'm really intrigued by these results that show, right, this like maybe this is driven by a bilingual production process more so than perception. And I think that tracks with like the artificial language learning literature too, which shows that like the participants in those studies are pretty good at tracking the probabilities that they see, even if they're not matching those in production. I think like another thing I was thinking about with regards to this, that I wonder if you could speak to, if this might be playing a role at all in this context. Something I was thinking about that would sort of lean back more on the maybe perception side of things is like, maybe like, what if in like context with bilingual speakers and or lots of learners of a language or something, maybe we're pretty good at tracking global probabilities, but maybe we're less good. Like the artificial language learning studies, stuff just shows up in free variation, and that's not a typical thing to see in natural language. And so, but maybe what might happen is that people get under cognitive load, or under, if they're learners, they may be less good at like tracking or even noticing like the contingencies between like the very social or linguistic features that might predict the choice of a certain variant. And so maybe that, does that make sense?
Yeah, no, that's totally making sense. And I think it's a great idea too. So now that reminded me, I'm actually not familiar with So you're an expert on that. So are there any statistical learning literature that's actually tracking conditional probabilities in the input and how participants do on those?
I know one looking at, oh gosh, I'm forgetting. I can email you or
Great.
something later. There was one that was looking at like speaker, there were like 2 speakers. And so it was looking at like socially or like speaker conditioned variation.
Yeah, okay.
And so that I know of that one, but I think it's a little bit underexplored.
Right. And,
yeah.
and also I think just sort of the contingency kind of the linguistic properties, right? So here I give you a toy example about, oh, you have 3 determiners that can show up before a noun. But in real languages, it's like this determiner shows up if the vowel is R, right? There's sort of contingencies. And I'm not aware of any studies, probably there are some there that was sort of looking at how people can track that sort of contingencies, which actually are more common in languages than this. And the word order is sort of a, that's why at the end I was saying word order is really it's relatively speaking, the easy case. In this kind of variation, there seems to be an easy case in natural languages, and there are way more complicated variations, and they are conditioned by other factors. Yeah, yeah. So I think that we're really excited to go into the sentence final particle domain to take a look to see what's going on there. Yeah.
Thank you.
Hi, thanks for the great talk. I'm curious, so what if we change the participant to the people in Macau and versus people in Guangzhou? And is there any big differences? I'm not sure if you're familiar with this field, because in my understanding, people in Macau have more, compared to the people in Hong Kong, have a more positive attitude towards the Mandarin. So it's just my understanding. So I'm curious if you have any thoughts about this.
Yeah, I don't know the exact picture on the language attitude picture on the ground, but I think I share your intuition. No, I haven't looked at anything in Macau, but that actually came to my mind just last week about it would be very interesting to compare Macau, Hong Kong, and speakers in Guangzhou, since they're really just next to each other, but the historical and social situations are very different. Yeah.
Any further questions? Discussion? Isaiah?
Hi, thank you for your talk. I was curious, maybe I missed this. When you asked about attitudes towards English, were there your own questions, or did you derive them from like another type of survey in the literature, or?
This was most of the questions were borrowed from another study. We looked at a particular Mandarin variety spoken in China. So there was this previous study we relied on. Yeah.
Okay, and were these attitudes more like explicit attitudes based off of like the questions that were asked, or are they more implicit in some
I
way?
think they're more explicit. They are more like, so some of the questions I showed you, how do you think this language sound like? Is it nice? Is it sound nice? And some other questions may be a bit less explicit. It's about, do you think immigrants in Hong Kong should take Cantonese, should take effort to learn Cantonese, or similar questions to speakers in Guangzhou? Do you think immigrants should take effort to learn Cantonese? Or do you think the local people should learn Mandarin? We have those sort of questions as well. Yeah, those may be less explicit. I think they get you the same results as what I have given you here. So speakers in Guangzhou do not have a particular preference about whether people should learn or should not learn Mandarin or Cantonese. But speakers in Hong Kong strongly prefer immigrants to learn Cantonese. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you.
All right, I'm just letting folks simmer for a moment more. Check on Zoom. How we doing, Zoom? Anything in the chat? Any emojis in the chat? No. Well, I think we might end here and thank again Dr. Xiang.
Thank you.
And thank you all.